Welcome to the SEI podcast series, a production of Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense and operated by Carnegie Mellon University. Today's podcast is available on the SEI website at www.sei.cmu.edu/podcast. My name is Suzanne Miller. I'm a principal researcher here in the Software Solutions Division of the SEI, and I'm very pleased today to introduce you to Rachel Kartch, who's a network analyst team lead in our CERT division of the SEI. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So we're going to be talking about DDoS, denial of service, distributed denial of service today. Tell us a little bit about sort of what in your background led you to working in this network analysis area that sort of leads us into this.
Sure. Well, so like you said, I'm currently a team lead for a group of analysts in the CERT division. We have a lot of different job duties, but one of the primary things that we do is we look at network traffic on our sponsor networks, and we're trying to understand what's happening. Is it normal? Is it abnormal? How do we know if we're looking at something abnormal, and what possible threats or bad conditions might be on the network? Prior to coming to CERT, I actually worked as a network engineer for about 15 years. I worked in a number of different environments. I worked at a couple of ISPs. I worked for a hosting company. I worked for a very large global financial corporation. And I worked as a consultant. And so in just about every one of those jobs, first of all, obviously, there was a lot of traffic analysis involved when we're trying to figure out how to engineer the network. But getting to the topic of today's podcast, I did sometimes find myself one way or another involved in a DDoS event. Especially when you're working for an ISP, you can find yourself responsible for the pipes for the attacker or the attacked party. And you need to understand how do you respond if your customer is under attack? How do you respond if your customer is attacking someone else? And so, for better or for worse, I have had some of that experience.
Wow. Well, I hadn't thought about being on the attacker side of things, so that's an interesting
and that's
side of it.
in some ways, honestly, that's a little bit worse because you're not just in a defensive mode then, but you've got to deal with a bad customer.
Yeah. So let's talk about DDoS and the recent event that makes this very timely for many of our viewers. Almost the whole East Coast was involved in this denial of service attack, and it was one of those things you mentioned before the podcast, that one of the apps on your phone didn't work, and that was kind of the first clue that there was something going on, and people's internet service was disrupted at the home level, and businesses, and Dyn was apparently the focus of the attack, but it certainly was a very well distributed in terms of reaching really pretty much all layers of the economy and into the consumers.
Yep.
So what, if anything, was how did that attack wreak such havoc on, what is it about that made it possible for it to do so much damage in that short time frame from your perspective?
The reason why that attack in particular was so bad, I mean, we can just say objectively it was a bad attack. It was large and it did a lot of damage to Dyn's service. But the reason everybody cared about it and the reason everybody was talking about it is because the attack was actually targeting somebody who provides services that make a lot of other parts of the internet work. If Dyn was just some industrial, like building widgets somewhere and they came under this attack, people wouldn't have been talking about it all day. It would not have been on CNN, The reason it mattered is because Dyn provides the underlying services that made so many major websites and major applications function. And that's honestly very scary. And we have seen, if you read Bruce Schneier, for example, in his blog, just a month or two ago, had made a comment about the fact that he was seeing that there had been a number of attacks that were happening over the past year where people seemed to be targeting, and he didn't go into specifics, so I can't name anybody, but they were targeting the providers of the internet infrastructure. And so you can imagine that an attack on Dyn would fall into that category. And so what's scary there is they attacked Dyn, but they took out lots of other stuff as well. Twitter was impacted, Reddit was impacted, my ability to use the Starbucks app was impacted, which is incredibly important.
Especially at 6:30 in the morning.
Exactly.
When all of us need that.
Yeah.
So that is one type of DDoS attack where you attack some element of the infrastructure. Just to give our viewers a little bit of idea of the breadth, what are some of the other categories of DDoS attacks and their likely impacts?
Okay, so there's no one standard way to classify DDoS attacks, but one of the systems that a lot of people who talk about this stuff use is they divide them up into volumetric, protocol, and application attacks.
Okay.
Volumetric attack, and I looked for numbers on this, like what percentage of attacks are volumetric? Everybody's got a different number, but what everybody agrees on is that volumetric attacks for now and for what we've been tracking in the past, volumetric attacks are the most common type. Definitely over 50% are volumetric. Volumetric is what it sounds like, large volumes of traffic. It can be very crude. All you're trying to do is fill somebody's internet pipe or just knock down their servers just because of a huge flood of traffic coming to them. But typically we're talking about filling pipes, so that's a volumetric attack. A recent example of a volumetric attack, a very well-known one, was in September, the attack on Brian Krebs' website. From what we know about that attack, from the details that have been published, that sounds like that was largely just a volumetric attack, and in fact it was one of the largest that has ever been seen. It was something like 620 gigabits per second of traffic that was being thrown at him, which was, it was something like twice as large as the next largest attack that had been seen. So it was huge. So that's one category.
Okay.
Second category of attacks, the protocol attacks. These are attacks that target weaknesses or soft spots in how a protocol is implemented. And an example of that would be a SYN flood. If you're familiar with, and that's SYN,
Right.
If you're familiar with the TCP three-way handshake. So the way the three-way handshake works, and this is what establishes a TCP connection, the client sends a SYN to the server, kind of saying, hi, I'm here and I would like to talk to you. The server sends back a SYN ACK, so it's saying, I acknowledge you and I am sending a SYN back. And then the client sends an ACK, three-way handshake is complete, and now you've got a TCP connection. What happens with a SYN flood is the attacker will send many, 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 many SYNs to the server. Those SYNs could all be coming from a single host with spoofed source IP addresses, so it looks like it's coming from thousands or millions of hosts, or it could actually be coming from thousands or millions of compromised hosts. You hear people talk about botnets, and so if you've got a whole bunch of infected devices, all of those devices are now being told by the command and control server to send a SYN to the target IP address.
Right.
So the server has now received a whole bunch of SYNs, and what the server, if it's vulnerable to a SYN flood, what it will do is it will bind resources. For each one of those SYN requests, it's like, okay, I've got a request for an open connection. I'm going to bind these resources so that I can prepare to, complete this connection.
It's like making a reservation.
Exactly. It's hey, I've got a whole bunch of people who want to connect to me right now. I'm going to bind these resources. The server sends back the SYN ACK to all the IP addresses that sent SYNs. Now, if those addresses are spoofed, the server is sending SYN ACKs to hosts that never sent the SYN, and the proper function of TCP is the host is going to drop it. The host that receives that SYN ACK is like, I don't know what this is and I don't care.
Right.
So they're going to drop it, and even if it wasn't spoofed, the malicious hosts are not going to reply to the SYN ACK with their ACK. They're going to ignore it. So the server now has all these bound resources, all these SYNs came in, it's sending back the SYN ACKs, nobody's helping it out, nobody's completing that three-way handshake. At this point, if the attacker has done their job right, that server has, all the resources are used up, it can't accept any more SYNs, it can't accept any more TCP connection requests, and therefore you have now completed your denial of service because the server is unable to accept any new connections.
So this is like having a restaurant with a bunch of empty tables because nobody showed up for their reservation.
Right,
And
exactly.
Nobody knows why. And now when you call them on their cell phone, the cell phone number is not right, so you don't know why you don't have anybody in your restaurant. Okay, all right.
And then the third type of attack is an application attack. And this is an attack that targets weaknesses or soft spots in how an application functions. Frequently, but not always, when we talk about an application attack, we are talking about an attack on a web server. So we're talking about something involving HTTP. Not always, but many times. And a good example of an HTTP attack is called slow LoRaS. The way slow LoRaS works, and in some ways it's a little similar to how a SYN flood works, in the sense that the attacker is going to send an HTTP request to the web server, but it's not going to complete the request. It's going to start the request, and then very, very slowly, hence the name, on some periodic basis, it's going to add another header to that request. But it's never actually going to complete it. And just like with a SYN flood, if the web server is vulnerable to slow LoRaS, it's going to be holding connections open. You know, it's going to be receiving a lot of these very, very slow connection requests. Connections never complete. Next thing you know, the web server, its connection table is full. It can't accept any new requests. So as far as the world is concerned, your website is down. So that's the slow LoRaS attack. And the Dyn attack that we were talking about, from what we know of it, and we do not have complete information, they have released some of the information publicly about the nature of the traffic, but not all of it. From what we know of that attack, it was at least partially an application attack, but in this case, the attack was on DNS. It was on the DNS application and not HTTP, because part of what happened with that attack was that the attacker was sending what, there's a few different names for this. Some people call it a random subdomain attack, which means that they were sending what looked like legitimate DNS requests, but they were for random, non-existent subdomains of domains that Dyn was hosting. So you just sort of prepend maybe a bunch of garbage characters onto a legitimate domain name, send that request to Dyn. Dyn doesn't know that that's attack traffic. Hey, this looks like a real DNS request to me. I better reply to it. Send millions of those at once, and you can overwhelm a name server.
I think the thing that, as somebody who doesn't work in this all the time, that gets me is that these are fairly, they're not complicated methods when it comes right down to it.
Yeah.
So, okay, make me feel better now. How do we protect? Do we know how to protect against these, and how? What are the methods that are proving promising? I won't say we've solved this. Obviously, we haven't.
Okay, yeah, I'll make you feel worse first.
Okay, go ahead. Make me feel worse.
So something that people will ask me is, how can I keep somebody from attacking me? And the answer is, go off the internet. You know, like if you want to prevent somebody from trying to attack you, unplug your website and go home, and don't ever check your email, and don't worry about it. The good news is that I won't say this is a solved problem, but the good news is that there are a lot of tools that are available so that people can protect themselves, at least from being completely overwhelmed, or protect themselves from being completely out of business. So just like with any other kind of disaster that you would imagine happening to your business, planning is really key. You cannot tell yourself, well, if I'm under attack, I've got some really smart people and we're going to figure it out. So you need to figure out in advance, what are you going to do? The first thing that you can do is look at your architecture. And by architecture, I mean a lot of different things. There's physical architecture. Look at how your network is put together. Do you have only a single internet connection? Do you have multiple internet connections, but they're all to the same provider? Are your servers all in a single data center? Do you have your servers geographically dispersed? And if so, how much? All of those things are important. But in addition, going back again to the Dyn event, some of the Dyn customers who were really impacted did not have secondary DNS providers. The Dyn was their only provider, and I think they counted on the fact that, well, Dyn has a lot of resiliency in their architecture. Dyn can protect themselves, so we're just going to use them. So you need to look at even things like your DNS, and you have to constantly be looking at the worst case scenario. What happens if our DNS provider is under attack? What happens if our data center blows up? So both looking for, just what happens if something goes down in general, as well as what happens if we're under attack. So you want to look at the architecture first. And if you see places where you've got bottlenecks, if you see places where you're maybe presenting a very rich target because you've got so many things in one easy to find location, you want to look at making your architecture a little bit more resilient. So that's number one. The second thing, and here's some good news, there are certain really well-known types of attack that can be mitigated with network hardware. So network firewalls, web application firewalls, load balancers, many of those today have either just like a checkbox that you can check that says like enable SYN flood protection, or has thresholds that you can configure and you can change to say, you know, like how many half-open TCP connections will I allow open? And obviously if you lower that number down, or if you lower how long, you know, you allow for a TCP connection to complete before you just time it out, you lower those, obviously you're going to make yourself more resistant to SYN floods because you're going to be limiting the number of open connections they can create and how long those connections can hang around. Similarly for the application attacks, and in particular for something like a web application firewall, the manufacturers of these devices know the signatures of these types of attack, and they know things that you can set and that you can adjust that's going to you know, keep your web server from holding all these connections open. Very commonly, a load balancer or web application firewall will not send an HTTP request back to the server until the request is completed. So all those partially completed connections, they're never touching the server because the network device knows I'm not sending this back there until I see it's a legitimate completed request. And then the other thing in terms of network hardware is there is purpose-built DDoS mitigation hardware that is designed to protect you from some of these types of attacks. The downside of this is where you're really, the network hardware isn't going to be able to help you too much is if you're under a volumetric attack. Because the volumetric attack, again, you know, somebody's sending 620 gigabits per second of traffic to your network. If your internet connection is not 630 gigabits.
Mine isn't.
Yeah, and most people's aren't. If your network connection isn't large enough to handle the flood of traffic, it doesn't matter what hardware you've got sitting at your front door that you know you're going to try to do something special to mitigate it because your internet connection is completely flooded. There's just nothing you can do. So you're not going to be able to deploy network hardware to foil large volumetric attacks. That gets us to the third suggestion that I have for things you can do, and I will admit that this suggestion is not for everyone. There's only going to be certain organizations that can really consider this, but you can consider just scaling up your bandwidth really big. There are some organizations who we work with where this is one of the approaches that they're taking. They realize they're going to be potentially under attack. They have the money to be able to do this. They're not necessarily going to be able to buy pipes big enough to foil the very largest attacks, but they can buy pipes big enough to foil, you know, maybe a less ambitious volumetric attack because they realize, you know, hey, it's just easiest for us to just have really big pipes. We have the money, we're willing to pay for this bandwidth even if we're not using it most of the time because it's that important to us that we protect ourselves.
So this is a risk-benefit kind of a situation, and you know, when you're speaking earlier, I was thinking, you know, we have a lot of security risk analysis techniques that help people to understand this. SEI's worked in that arena for a long time, and so this is just one more case where if you've done your homework, you can have, you know, business continuity is essentially what we're trying to help people to achieve.
Exactly.
So that you have, but what sounds really important is looking at the entire chain. You can't just look at your network, you can't just look at your bandwidth, you have to look at your suppliers. So there's a supply chain management aspect. And I have to imagine that a lot of businesses that are not of the really large size probably don't even know if they are supported by Dyn or they're supported by this, you know, DNS provider or that ISP. So, well, they know their ISP, but I mean, there's got to be gaps in their knowledge. So how does the little guy deal with some of these issues that, even though the method may be simple, the solution is a little bit complex?
Well, that gets me to my fourth suggestion for how can you plan and try to make yourself less vulnerable, which is outsource. And honestly, this is going to be probably the best solution for all but the largest organizations. And when I say outsource, I mean a few different things. Number one, everybody should be talking to their ISP and finding out what the ISP's procedures are if you are under attack. First of all, what can you do? You know,
Sure.
like, hey, ISP, what will you do to help me if I'm under attack? Some ISPs, actually, some ISPs have separate paid products, you know, DDoS
Sure.
protection, but every ISP should be able to tell you, if you report that you are under DDoS attack, here are the things we can do. And so you want to know not only, you know, what can they do for you, but what information do you need to provide to them when you are under attack? You want to find that out in advance, you know, so you're not like calling them in a panic and saying, we're under attack and we have no idea what to do. So number one, talk to your ISP, find out what they can do for you. Second thing is there are companies that specialize in DDoS mitigation, what they call in the cloud. So cloud scrubbing is what many of these services are referred to. And this is really the best way, I think, that we know right now for companies that are under large volumetric attacks to be able to do something about mitigating it. Is you're either going to have your ISP block it, or you can work with one of these cloud scrubbing services. You've hopefully contracted with them in advance so that you're not suddenly in a panic doing your shopping while you're under attack.
Yeah, that's not a good idea.
So you contract with them in advance, and when you're under attack, possibly they've already detected it depending on what kind of monitoring they're doing, or possibly you're calling them up and saying, hey, guess what, we're under attack. And then what happens is your traffic, your inbound traffic is routed to the cloud service provider. Typically they have many locations, so it may be routed to several different locations, it may just be routed to the one nearest you, it may be routed to whatever is closest to the source of the traffic. Either way, your inbound traffic gets routed to one of these cloud scrubbing centers. They do what's called scrubbing the traffic. They try to identify the malicious traffic and drop that out and then send you the good traffic.
Gotcha.
So you still hopefully will be getting your traffic, but with the malicious traffic removed from it.
So if Starbucks had that kind of a thing going on, your Starbucks application would have been slow because you have this extra step, but it wouldn't have been denied altogether. It
might have
simple
been,
example.
Yeah, it might have been slow. These services are not perfect. As you can imagine, there is effort involved in trying to identify which is the malicious traffic and which is the good traffic. And we do know that depending on the nature of the attack traffic, some types of attack traffic are easier to identify as attack and drop than others. There are other types where it's harder to tell, is this legitimate or is this not? If we look again at the Dyn incident, those DNS requests, they may have looked legitimate. So how can you tell? I mean, that's Dyn's business. They're doing DNS. So how can you tell if any given request is part of attack traffic or is just one of the many legitimate retries that they were seeing as all the people who were trying to use their Starbucks app or get to Twitter or whatever.
Oh, I'll just reboot my system and then it'll be fine.
Yeah, so it's as people continually tried to get to these sites, that added to the traffic. So the challenge there for a scrubbing service would be figuring out which of this is legitimate and which of this is not, and dropping the bad stuff. And then the other way that you would look at outsourcing would be, and this is in particular if your web presence is a huge part of your business. Some companies just have a website and it's like, here's what we do, but it doesn't really matter. For other companies, their website is their business. Again, think about someplace like Twitter. Like, that's the business. People need to be able to get to Twitter. In that case, you could look at hosting your website or your application or whatever it is at a hosting company where DDoS protection and mitigation is part of the service. And some well-known brand names out there, you know, you can speak to them and find out, what do you do if my website is under attack? How do you protect me? Some of them can do things like dynamically spin up plenty of additional instances of the website in order to try to absorb the volume. They may provide scrubbing in their data centers. So there are a lot of different options. But again, look at hosting your stuff. Especially if you're a small or medium business and your web presence is very important, look at hosting it someplace where DDoS protection is part of the service.
So the interesting thing about this is the regional focus of this. I actually happened to be in California at the time that this occurred. So sorry, sweetie, my Starbucks app was fine, but my brother works in the security domain, so he knew about this 6 hours before we saw it on any of the local news or anything like that, and so that's another aspect to this, is that there's you can have physical differences in how, where you are. So some of these ideas of the cloud scrubbing that occurs in multiple places really has, it resonates with me because we were fine.
Yeah.
There wasn't anything going on in our area.
Yeah.
And yet all of these people at home, were impacted in negative ways that you just didn't even think about until you really start to understand what's happening here.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, I mean, so it happened that way because of, because of the hosts that the attackers chose to hit. Next week, it could easily be California. You never know.
Hopefully, I'll be here when that happens. You can't always arrange your travel though, so that you're in the place that's not being hit.
Yeah.
And that's the truth of it. These attackers are going to continue to try, bigger and better from their viewpoint. Attacks. So, at some point I would expect we'll see something that tries to attack across an even broader spectrum.
Yeah.
So we are trying, this podcast and other things that we do at the SEI are all trying to make the public more aware and make organizations more aware of the security issues, the security risks, opportunities for mitigating those, planning for those. What are some of the places that you would recommend on the SEI's sort of web sphere that people look for this kind of information to help them get a better handle on not just denial of service, but other kinds of risks that impact them or could impact them in terms of their security?
Absolutely. So first of all, what I would recommend is people take a look on the SEI website at some of the incident management resources that we have. We have a lot of great resources from our CSIRT operations folks, including, maybe you've got a company and, hey, you don't even have any sort of incident management group at all. You don't even know where to start. We have resources for, where do you start?
Right.
How do you build this capability? And
training.
Exactly, and training as well. So, I like I said, I wish that I could reassure you that DDoS is not a scary thing and you can keep it from happening, but considering that you can't, the best thing that you can do is prepare yourself. And so our incident management resources on the SEI website are really, really good to help people just prepare, not just for DDoS, but for all sorts of other problems that can happen. The other thing that I think would be a really, really useful tool is taking a look at our Silk toolset that's available through the SEI website. The Silk toolset includes free software that you can use to set up a network flow collection and analysis infrastructure. Right. And what that will let you do is, first of all, you can get a better understanding of your normal traffic profile. And that's key for if you do find yourself under attack and you're trying to figure out what is this attack. If you know what your traffic normally looks like, it'll be easier for you to, you can look at what's going on right now and you can see how it's different. Is this notably different from what we normally see? Even just in terms of the volume, that'll help you figure out if you're under a volumetric attack, but also, is it significantly different protocols than we normally see, things like that. So that collection infrastructure can really help you, first of all, to figure out if you're under attack and figure out what kind of attack. And then that's also, if you do have to call your ISP or if you do have to call your scrubbing company, you can let them know, here's what we're seeing, here's the type of traffic, because that information is going to be really, really useful for anybody who's trying to help you to trace the attack back to its source, to block it, to scrub the traffic. So again, the Silk tools will be really, really helpful for you just to start understanding what your network traffic looks like, and as a resource that you can use if you do think you might be under attack.
So your DDoS is one type of network analysis kind of a thing. What are some of the areas that your team is focusing on right now outside of DDoS that you think will eventually contribute to knowledge in this area?
So one of the big things that not just my team, but a lot of people in this field are interested in right now is getting away from signature-based analytics and moving more towards behavior-based analytics or anomaly-based analytics. The idea being it's fairly easy if there is a particular bad type of traffic or an attack. If you know exactly what it looks like, obviously you can develop a signature to detect it. If it's like, well, you see 3 packets that look like this, and then you see 2 packets that look like this, and it's coming from this IP address, it's very, very easy to design a signature to say, oh, that's a bad thing, because I know exactly what it looks like. It's a lot harder to find the bad thing when you don't exactly know what the bad thing looks like. All you're really looking for is, did anything strange happen?
Right.
Did anything that's out of the ordinary? But that is not as easy as it sounds, because of course there's a whole lot of questions you have to ask yourself in order to define strange. So my team works a lot these days on trying to build analytics that are not based on known signatures, but are based on anomalies, that are based on changes in behavior. And we're also just now launching some work where we're going to bring in some other folks and try to apply machine learning to this problem as well. I think everybody's working on machine learning right now, but it is. I think it's really going to help us, because so often when we speak with network analysts, when we speak with the people who are out on the front lines doing this job, there's a lot of I don't know what such and such is, but I'll know it when I see it. There's a lot of instinctive kind of knowledge stuff that's buried in the brain, and you can't quite articulate why you know what you know. And we do find that sometimes computers can make that task very easy. They can articulate it, and they can tell you,
systematize it.
Exactly. And so we're excited about the possibilities of machine learning to help us to articulate those things that we know it when we see it.
Excellent. I want to thank you very much for this very timely discussion. I know there are lots of people, I'm not the only one out there that's worried about what is this going to do to me, but even not as an individual, as an organization, it's a much bigger impact. So I really appreciate your insights. I know I learned a lot about what to watch for. I have new questions to ask to my ISP, and I really thank you for that. So we will be taking care of giving out all the resource links that you've talked about, and any others that are germane to this will be up on the transcript for the podcast. So we won't be giving URLs here.
Okay.
And I want to thank our viewers today. I hope you learned some things about how to protect yourself from this imminent and recent kind of thing. Start by looking at this podcast and the transcript, and that will be available, as it always is, at www.sei.cmu.edu/podcast, or go to the iTunes U site for Carnegie Mellon University. It will also be there. I want to thank all of our viewers today, and as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send an email to info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you for viewing.